This morning, in the 6th Sunday after Epiphany, this lesson this morning really looks at the blessings and the woes. And it's an interesting lesson because it looks at Jeremiah. The problem is now that I called Jeremiah Isaiah, I'm going to call him that for the whole rest of the morning. Psalm 1, and then Luke chapter 6. And we're going to do a little bit of Hebrew, Greek, and Latin to kind of show you how we got here, but not a whole lot, but enough that you can work your way through things. The first thing is when we look at Jeremiah, the first reading from the Old Testament, this passage is picked because it's got these blessings and woes within it. Jeremiah 7:7, for example, right in the middle of today's reading, says, "Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord." And so right at the very start of this reading, or in the middle of this reading, we've got this blessed. And then in Jesus' Beatitudes, you've got blessed is, blessed is, blessed is, along those lines. Psalm 1 also talks about blessed is the man who, and so this is what ties these three texts together. Now, blessing as a primary statement, it has to be stressed. It has nothing, let me say that again. Blessing, when we talk about blessing in the Old Testament, is a statement that is perhaps the most important and the most significant thing that could happen to a person in a person's life. Abraham, when he sends Ishmael off, and he's talking to God about this whole situation about having to send Ishmael off, Isaac is the chosen one. Abraham holds off until he secures God's blessing for Ishmael. In other words, the thing that he wants to make sure, the bottom line, is to make sure that Ishmael will have God's blessing on him before he's going to send this kid and his mother off into the wilderness, which is kind of another interesting story, but we can go there some other time. In the ancient world, to secure God's blessing was really kind of the highest virtue, the highest thing, the highest goal, the highest aspiration you can have in your whole life. In our culture, in our society, we talk about a person achieving wealth or status or success in life. These are the things that we say that a person has really made it. In the ancient world, to say that God had blessed you or you were blessed by God, this was the key thing that really marked success in life. So it's a very, very different worldview, but it really helps us to understand what's going on here. Now, when I was talking a little bit about the Hebrew, the Greek, and the Latin here, in our English, it says, "Blessed is the man." Now, what we miss are the languages that fall below this. In the Hebrew here, it has Baruch Giver. Giver for man, but Baruch, this is where you get barakah. You know, when you hear someone on television or a movie and they start announcing the 18 benedictions, you know, barakah, isha, when they start going through this is the same verb, the same idea there that's going on. Now, when they translate it over into the Greek, in what we call the Septuagint, this Greek translation of the Old Testament, what they used there was eulogomenios, this idea of, and then anthropos. But it's where we get the word eulogy from, to speak well of someone. Now, blessing started off with this idea of, the Hebrew idea for barak really comes from the idea of to kneel before someone and then say something good about them. So kneeling before a king and saying your majesty, your highness, or something like that. And then for the king or this high official to say something nice about the person. So barakah, or the Hebrew idea of a blessing, really starts from this idea of saying something nice about someone, but then it gets extended to the whole idea of that God saying something nice or God pronouncing his blessings upon you as well. So it kind of starts with this idea of saying something good and then gets developed. The Greek picked up that idea when they translated this, and so when we say a eulogy, this Greek idea comes from eu, which means good, and then logo, word. So a eulogy is to say good words about someone. So they bring it over into the Greek, it becomes a eulogy, or in this case it's a verb form of it. But the idea here is that blessed is the man in Jeremiah when they translate it is along this idea of the one who is well spoken about, this person. And ideally within the context, this is someone that God has spoken something good about. Later on, when Jerome, around 400 AD, translates it into Latin, the passage here gets translated as benedictus vir. And, benediction, to say a blessing, benedictus gets used here. Now, the reason why I'm going through this is because when we get over to Psalm 1, we're going to see that we use different Hebrew, Greek, and Latin words. And you'll see how that fits together. But all of this helps us to understand a little bit about the passage, and I find it interesting since I put the slides together, it goes in. But the entire passage here, let's back up to verse 5 and move forward. It says, "Thus says the Lord, cursed is the man who trusts in man, and makes flesh his strength, whose heart turns away from the Lord. He is like a shrub in the desert. He shall not see any good come. He shall dwell in the parched places of the wilderness, in an uninhabited salt land." Now, immediately at the very start here, the person who trusts in man, who trusts in human strength, who trusts in other people, he says, is like a person, he's like a shrub. And I have a friend who used to speak poorly of the second Bush president, and they used to say, always refer to him as shrub, because a shrub is a small bush. I'm sorry, but now the thing I like about the second Bush, there's kind of two things I really like. One, I really like what he does with language. The second thing is, I'm not going to go into it. He really does some. Everybody thinks he made these faux pas or just mistakes, but when you actually think about what he did, turning like nouns into verbs, so he would be speaking in Iowa and he would be talking about the farmatization of the environment here. And everybody goes, farmatization? What? That's not a word. Here's the thing I like about it. You immediately know what he meant. In other words, you won't find that word in the dictionary, but linguistically, something takes place in his brain, and you just see this little creative synapse fire that really creates this new word on the spot that everybody knows exactly what he means. The second thing I like about it is I can't remember a single incident in his presidency where he said something negative about somebody. You got to say there wasn't a mean bone or a vindictive bone in his body. So there are kind of two good things I really appreciate about his presidency. Going back to this here, this shrub. I'm sorry about that. This is what a person who trusts in man or trusts in man's life is like. It's this small, little, desolate bush out in the wilderness. Yesterday, a friend of mine set out to go for a bicycle ride, which turned out to be the bicycle ride from hell because it started out with blue skies and sunshine, about 45 degrees. In 15 minutes, it was down to freezing. We had like 40 miles an hour wind, and we were getting rained and snowed on. And then to top it off, he broke his carbon fiber bike on the ride, Yes, so he's that guy. But the thing that really bothered me were these tumbleweeds that would just come blasting across the road. We were down south of Fountain. And you had to dodge them because you get them into your wheels, you're coming to a stop pretty quick. But that's what these shrubs are like. They're these dried up, really gnarly little bushes out in the wilderness. And they're in a salt place. And so the image here is a person who trusts in man straight. He's this dried up little bush that really produces no benefit to the culture or the society around it, and they're in a very dry and desolate place. In the second stanzas here, he goes on, he says, blessed. This is where we get the baraka, giver, the blessed man, the eulogy man, the benedictus. Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, whose strength is in the Lord. He is like a tree planted by water. So now immediately you see the contrast between the shrub in the dry place and the tree planted by water that sends out its roots by the stream. So its roots go deep. There's stability here. Does not fear when the heat comes, for its leaves remain green. Is not anxious in the years of drought, for it does not cease to bear fruit. As opposed to the shrub that's in the wilderness, that is dried up and is in the salt plain, this tree goes deep, it's solid, it's secure, it remains green during years of drought, but also it's a blessing to its culture and society in that it gives off fruit for other people. And so the contrast between where you place your trust and this blessing that comes as a result. Do you want to be like the shrub, or do you want to be like the tree? And you see how it's defining what this word blessing or being cursed is like. And then finally it continues, he says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? And you go, man, that sounds just like Paul in the New Testament, doesn't it? You know, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. You can see where he gets these ideas from. Verse 10, I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruits of his deeds. Now, the key thing about this is this passage is really interesting because it gives kind of two foundations for a human life. Where are you going to put your trust? Are you going to put your trust in humankind and its strength and what a person can do, or are you going to put your trust in the Lord and what God can do? And then the results that come out of that being like the shrub or the tree. The other thing that this passage does is it lets us know that the root problem for mankind really isn't being the shrub or the tree. What that springs from is from the heart of man. That the heart of man is deceitful above all things. That the problem for mankind isn't what we see coming off it, sort of the results being a fruit or, a tree or a shrub. It's that those two plants really spring from this deceitful heart and what's going on within our hearts. So when we talk about New Testament, Paul's view of sin or salvation or various things like this, this is not something new that gets invented in the New Testament. This is something that's back in the Old Testament, and it's found in Jeremiah. Now moving on from Jeremiah, we move into Psalm 1. And I apologize if these classes seem like I move fast. I definitely am, because I'm doing 4 passages in about 30 minutes. Psalm 1 was placed there by whoever compiled the book of Psalms as an introduction to the book of Psalms. And there's actually a debate whether Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 were originally one psalm, and then somebody split the two in half because they flow well together. And so it's either they split them in half, in other words, way, way back, let's say 1000 BC, they were one psalm, and then when they compiled the book of Psalms, they put that there, and then they split into 2 to kind of give like Psalm 1, Psalm 2 for memorization or whatever. Or they found 2 psalms that work really well together and then put them together. The key thing is when you look at the book of Psalms to realize is that even when you read through it, it'll say this is a psalm of David, this is a psalm of Asaph, this is a psalm of so-and-so. You realize that this is a book that has numerous authors to the different psalms. And they were written for worship, for confession, for when you did a religious pilgrimage up to Jerusalem. So around Psalm 90 to about 121, you'll see they're called Psalms of Ascent because you sang them when you were going up the mountain to Jerusalem. So they were songs of ascent. This is what you sang as you were going up to the temple for a festival. Psalm 1 gets put here because whoever compiled and brought all these different psalms together into one book realized that this makes a great introduction to the entire book. Of the 150 psalms, they said this is the key one. Now this psalm starts off with, "Blessed is." Oh, and the picture on the left is a cover from the St. Louis Psalter. It's from around 1200 AD, and you'll see why this is important here in the beginning. But it opens in the English with, "Blessed is the man." Now here, once again, we're going to go back into our Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, okay? So if that bores you, you can just, Dave's up here going blah, 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 and you can move on. Or you can pay attention. Now, as opposed to Jeremiah, where the Hebrew says, Barakah Giver, here in this passage, it says Esher Ish. It's two different words. Ish for man instead of Giver, and then Esher instead of Barakah. Now, they overlap to a certain extent, but Ish here is important, the word for man. And I made the Ish red so you can see the word for man in red, and then the blessing word in blue, so you can I should have said that in the previous one. Ish is important because when God creates Adam in the garden in chapter 2, and in chapter 1, where it says that he brought man together and it was good, be fruitful and multiply, this is the word that the Hebrew author uses, Ish. It's what we call the unmarked term. It's generic. You could say person. It's not specifically talking about man, but biologically. It's talking about people as a whole. When it came over into the Greek, they used a Greek word, makarios, which talks about blessing or blessed, and then aner for man. And so now all of a sudden you've got, notice in Jeremiah it was eulogy, the Greek word for eulogy, and then anthropos, where we get anthropology for. Here you got two completely different words, makarios and aner. Once again, there's a lot of synonyms between the terms, but you can see how they're using different terms here. And I'll explain the differences here in a second. And then the final one, and when it comes over into Latin, it's beatus. Instead of benedictus, it's beatus vir. Now, I took the cover of the Psalm book and blew it up here because when this person was copying this book of the Psalms during the Middle Ages, and they were doing this illuminated manuscript, notice how they have this large letter B right in the center panel. Okay, B for beatus, starting the book of Psalms. But if you go up into the right-hand side, right-hand top corner coming down, you can see you got the big letter B starting off in the middle, and then at the top it goes E-A-T-U-S-V-I-R. Right there in that center illumination, at the very start of this book of Psalms, the first two words in Latin, beatus vir, and then if we were to go back and look at the bottom, then you get the third, fourth, then you get the rest of Psalm 1 at the very bottom coming across there. So the way they illuminate it, they really put this big emphasis on blessed is the man. And then it moves into the rest of the psalm. So whoever did this illuminated manuscript really wants you to know this is important. This is where we're going to put all of our emphasis and weight. Now, a little bit about these terms as we come across. Esher, Ish in the Hebrew, I was talking about Ish being the generic term. Esher is also one of these, but instead of being a person that is spoken well of, like before a king or something like that, this one really brings across the idea of the state that it produces when you're blessed. In other words, I'm in a state of being blessed. I'm in a state of happy. I'm in a state of success. I feel good type thing. And it's not based upon how much money or how much cattle or various things like this. Job talks about being blessed, but he's lost everything. So it's not dependent on your circumstances or things like this. It's a state of knowing that you're really blessed. In the Greek, again, you get this makarios term, and it could talk about happiness, but it's not determined on happiness. They have terms, if they wanted to speak specifically about happiness, they could use a term eudaimonia or eudoia that talks about being really happy, like when somebody tells a joke or something great or anything like that. They could have used that term instead. Here they use this term makiros, which once again brings across this idea that you feel satisfied, you feel good, but you have that because you're in a state of being blessed. You're in a state of feeling that spiritually you have success, that God has conferred something upon your life. And then when we come down to the Latin, beatus vir, the same term gets picked up and brought across that way. So it's not that God has said something good about you or you've said something good about God, but you're in that state that this is what's happened to you. You're blessed because God has said something about you, and now you're like, yes, I've arrived. This is where I'm at. So, moving on. Blessed is a man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. Now I'm going to stop there for a second, because when we look at this, immediately at the very start here, we get these three images that come across, or these three parallelisms. Blessed is the man, and it starts off kind of interesting negatively, who doesn't walk in the counsel of the wicked, who doesn't stand in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. Now we miss a lot of the imagery that goes on here, what we would call frame linguistics. So let me kind of illustrate this. I use an example I use with Michael Williams. When you go into a restaurant and you get a menu and you have a waiter and you're going to be served, these are all terms that you understand when you go into a restaurant. But let's shift it a little bit. If you go into a fast food restaurant, you're not given a menu. Where's the menu? It's up on the wall. Who serves who? You pick up the food, you take it to your table. There's no waiter, there's a cash register type thing. And so just by saying fast food restaurant rather than restaurant, immediately you realize when I talk about menu, it's different. In a restaurant, a menu is going to be something that you hold like this. In a fast food restaurant, it's going to be up on the wall. Same type of idea here. Now, walk in the counsel of the wicked. That's pretty easy to understand. That comes across in English. You're going to walk, you're going to go through life, but you're doing it with someone, a wicked person, kind of telling you about how to go about doing it, where you're going to go. Now, stand in the way of the sinners. That should, oftentimes that's translated as stand in the assembly of the sinners. This would be when there's a gathering of elders or people to make a decision. And the idea here is that you're standing in that, let's say, board meeting of sinners, and you're making decisions with them. And so the picture here isn't just kind of like, when we're out for coffee hour standing around. No, this is much more of a gathering for a purpose type thing. You're gathering at the city gate to decide what you're going to petition the king about when he comes to visit your town, or building. You all go out and as the elders of the city, you're going to decide you need to rebuild the city gate. You're standing around, you're deciding how you're going to do it. So it's kind of a more official thing. And then sitting in the seat of scoffers. The thing that we miss, I brought this up last week, is seats were positions of authority. It's just the opposite of our culture. You guys all have the seats. I'm up here standing. In the ancient world, I would be the one sitting. You would be standing. Because seats were expensive. Not everybody had them. Just kind of another little kind of tidbit, since I already brought up shrub, I'll bring in a better one this time. The expression going to the wall. You know that expression, yeah. If you go in the old medieval cathedrals or churches, you'll notice that on the walls, about this high up, there's a little ledge that comes out, and it's usually angled down, sticks out about 6 inches. That was for when during the service, if you got really tired, or you were old, or a woman was pregnant, you could go to the wall and then sit. This was a way to get some rest because the churches didn't have pews or seats within them. The only seats were up for the clergy or for the choir. Everybody else stood through the whole service. And they were stone floors, so when you knelt, you meant it. You know, none of this padded kneeler stuff that we got today. But here when it says sit in the seat of scoffers, this is someone who's sitting in a very dignified position with other leaders or rulers in making a decision. So it all comes off these very embodied acts of what we do, walk, sit, stand, and who we're doing it with. But the picture right here at the very beginning is that the person who trusts in God avoids all these dimensions in their ways and their life with the wicked. They don't follow them, they don't emulate their pattern of life, and they don't associate with them. No matter who they are or how powerful they might be, they just don't do business with these people. And so to put this right at the beginning of Psalms really sets the tone for the book and makes it very important and something that we need to pay attention to. It goes on. In verse 3, you got, but his delight is in the law of the Lord. Now this is very interesting because this is the Hebrew word Torah for law. And some scholars will argue, the Jews really didn't elevate the Torah, the law of Moses, until around 400 BC. But by the same token, they'll put this psalm back around 1000 BC. And here, right here in this psalm, it talks about the Torah. So whoever wrote this psalm has a very high view of the first 5 books of Moses. And so this psalm makes a connection between the book of Psalms and the law of Moses. But it also lets you know that just as you read the book of Moses, you also need to read these. So it's kind of like law of Moses and worship are the two things that this psalm brings together. Verse 3, he's like a tree planted by streams of water. And you go, where have we heard that before? Jeremiah is actually going to get written around 600 BC. So Jeremiah is picking this up from the book of Psalms. In other words, when he used that in chapter 17, it wasn't a new metaphor or image that he used. He actually probably pillaged it from Psalm 1 here. And then verse 4, it says, the wicked are not so, but they are like the chaff that the wind drives away. As opposed to Jeremiah, who says that the wicked are like a shrub dried up in the wilderness. Here in this psalm, it says they're like the chaff. And it makes an even more vivid picture that you got this big, beautiful tree planted by streams, and then you get this chaff from a dried up plant, the tumbleweeds I was dodging yesterday, that are just getting blown along by the wind. So you get these beautiful images. Nothing from the notes here. 1 Corinthians, the third passage for today's reading, I'm not going to spend too much time with, because even though it's a phenomenal passage, I want to stick with these blessings and curses, or the blessings and woes, the Beatitudes. But when we look at 1 Corinthians 15, what I want to do is show you how this lays out structurally, because when you see the structure behind it, all of a sudden you go, now I understand what Paul's arguing in this passage. So I'm going to lay it out. What you have is a series of if-then constructions. If this, then that. So he goes, if Christ is risen, how do you say there is no resurrection from the dead? Now, one of the problems that the Corinthians had was this view of the resurrection from the dead and what that means to their lives. And certain people think that they're already raised, they're already spiritual beings, they're above all things, they judge all things, and no one judges them. Type idea, they kind of see themselves as sort of super spiritual. And then others are really worried about that they could lose their future inheritance in life. So 1 Corinthians 15 is a very important chapter in the book. But in this part here, the logic is he's going into the resurrection. Last week we looked at the creed. Here's the kind of logic of it. If Christ is risen, how do you say there is no resurrection from the dead? In other words, if Christ didn't raise from the dead, how can you go around denying that we're going to raise from the dead? If there is no resurrection from the dead, then Christ is not risen. So in other words, if you deny we're going to have a future resurrection, then you have to deny that Christ rose from the dead, but you get into a logical problem. And then, if Christ is not raised, our preaching is vain. Your faith is in vain. We are false witnesses. In other words, now he goes to personal experience. If no resurrection from the dead, then Christ is not risen. There it goes. If Christ is not raised, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins, and the dead have perished. And once again, going back to personal experience, this whole idea of if Jesus isn't risen, then all these feelings you have about being forgiven, God's transformation in your life, that's, totally invalid and bunkers.
I'm reading the epistle on the clock through this thing, and he repeats his argument. He says it twice in the same paragraph. And I think, I got it the first time. Why are we doing it twice?
It's a Greek rhetorical strategy of coming back on yourself. Yeah, and so when he comes back on himself, then he'll take a slightly different tack. Then he'll come back on himself and come back. So just be glad you're not reading the entire chapter 15, all 58 verses, because he does this numerous times throughout but here's the key thing to realize, I think, in doing that. We read this letter as a text. For probably the first 18 to 1900 years of the church, they heard it read out loud. And so it's very different when you're hearing this read out loud as opposed to standing up in the lectern and reading it. Because you're seeing the repetitions and you're going, oh, I already said that. But if someone's just hearing it, hearing those repetitions sinks it deeper and helps them to memorize and remember it. Good question, thanks. Second stanza here. If in Christ we have hope in this life only, we are of all people most to be pitied. In other words, if we believe in the resurrection and it hasn't taken place, we're complete fools. But in fact, Christ is raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who fallen asleep. And that idea of the first fruits, this is in Israel, in the springtime when they get the first little berries on the plants, the first fruit on the tree, the first birth of a lamb, they would bring those to the temple as an offering, because then God would bring in the rest of the harvest as the year goes along. In other words, by worshiping God and bringing in the first fruits, then they would be blessed with God's bounty for the rest of the year. Okay, into Luke. In Luke chapter 6, we have these blessings once again. Jesus lifted up his eyes to his disciples, and he said, "Blessed are you who are poor." Now, yes. When we have these blessings here, in the Greek, this is the word makarois that they used in Psalm 1. But when they translate it over to Latin, this is beatus. And this is why we call these the Beatitudes. It's not that we're to be this attitude that I've heard a lot of people say. Helps you remember it. But it's off the Latin, the Beatitudes, or like we saw with that Psalm book from the Latin from 1190. Beatus vir, right at the very beginning of the Psalms. So all these Beatuses are, this is the person who is blessed by God, the state that they're in. They're in a blessed state by God. But look what it says. Blessed are you who are poor. And during that time, poverty was something that was ripe within the world. If you've ever been to Honduras or El Salvador or India or some of these places, and you go into the slums there, and you just see poverty that just stretches as far as the eye can see, and people living in cardboard houses that are just one room, and you have a family of 6 or 8 in there. This is the type of situation in ancient Israel, that you would have extreme poverty out in the countryside. And so for Jesus to come along and say, "Blessed are the poor," would have been, on one hand, they would have gone, what the heck are you talking about? This is not what Moses talked about in the Old Testament. This is not what the Psalms talk about. This is not what the prophets railed about. This huge, the wealthy people owning all the land and everybody else being reduced to serfs or peasants that worked the land for them. To say that didn't make any sense. But because in Jesus, God's salvation is breaking into the world, and God's new work in the world is breaking forth, and the kingdom of God is breaking forth into the world, now, all of a sudden, a person who believes in that, like Psalm 1, blessed is the person who trusts in the Lord, now you can really say that they are blessed. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are you who are hungry. Blessed are you who weep. Blessed are you when people hate you. I'll come right to you if I don't throw something at me. The other thing to realize this is that oftentimes I'll talk about the upside down world that the Bible talks about, that the values of the Bible are completely different than ours. We always like to talk about the blessed person as a guy who lives over by the Broadmoor, who drives the, really fancy Honda Element or something like this. But here in the Psalms, it's a completely different picture. The person that's blessed are the poor. It's the hungry. It's those who weep and those who hate you. There's a very upside down world that's taking place here. Okay, so. Yeah, what happens here is, I got a few minutes. It's what we talk about when we talk about the exact words or the exact voice. Ipsa verba or ipsa vox, the Latin theologians came up with. Ipsa verba, the very words of Jesus. Ipsa vox, the very voice or the message of Jesus. Luke probably preserves the ipsa verba. This is what Jesus said out on the countryside when he's preaching. Matthew's gospel, St. Augustine named it, he called it the handbook for the church. This is where we get the Lord's Prayer, okay? Why do we say the Lord's Prayer? Because he's got it in there. But Matthew has all these sorts of things. The other thing Matthew does is Luke's gospel records these words where it's Jesus speaking to the poor on the countryside. Matthew, when he's reading his gospel, he's going, okay, I want to make this work out in these churches in Damascus and Antioch and Syria and Alexandria, Egypt. So what he does is he takes the words, but he makes it preach in any situation. So blessed are the poor in spirit. So now it's not locked into the Galilean countryside with all the peasants. Now it can work anywhere in any situation. So he takes it and he lets you know the context of what's going on there. Let me see, moving on here. Luke also pairs the blessings with these woes. Just as Jeremiah said, cursed is the man, Matthew pairs it up with these, woe to you who are rich, woe to you who are full, woe to you who laugh now. I always think that was kind of interesting. I don't quite understand the cultural values there that blessed are you who weep, but a person who laughs, this is wrong. We were up in Leadville, and somehow I got the job of babysitting our friends' family's kids. So I had these, 6 kids under 10 years old. And there's this old historic bar right on the main street in Leadville. They make natural sassafras root beer. They make their own there. So I lean in the door, I say, hey, it's like 11 o'clock in the morning, can I bring these kids in and get some root beer? Like, oh yeah, bring them in. So we all go in, we belly up at the bar. This one little girl, must have been 8 years old, got in a big debate with me that this could not be a bar because there weren't a bunch of big guys standing around laughing. So woe to you who laugh. That would have been Hannah's take on this whole thing. And woe to you who speak well of you. But you can see this divergent worldview where the church in America, we tend to privilege wealth, power, position, but we're not getting those from the New Testament. And N.T. Wright talks about, he says, that when we model our lives and ministry according to the Beatitudes is when real change takes place. Not when we try to institute a new Holy Roman Empire by legal legislations. It's when the church embodies and lives out the Beatitudes in community that people are attracted to the church and we have a lasting impact upon our culture. So the Beatitudes are incredibly important. They go all the way back to 1000 BC, get picked up in the book of Psalms, reflected in Jeremiah, and then picked up by Jesus as well. And they're really central to how we live our lives and the perspective we place upon our lives. I'll close there because we have about 7 or 8 minutes, and so I can answer questions, maybe out in the other room, or while we're straightening up things here, you can come on up, but we need to get ready for the next service. So.